On my birthday, my grandson looked at my hands and said, "You, Grandpa, your fingers look like tree roots." The whole table laughed, except me. I kept my eyes on the plate, on the slow swirl of gravy soaking into the mashed potatoes. My fork paused midair, my smile still stretched across my face like a mask I hadn't realized I was wearing too tight. I didn't say anything, not because I had no words, but because I knew none of them would have listened. It wasn't the first time. Last Thanksgiving, it was my cracked knuckles. The Christmas before that, a joke about how my fingers looked like branches with arthritis. Always something, always a laugh. They didn't mean harm, I know that. They were just kids. Smart, sharp-tongued, raised on smooth screens and smooth lives. They'd never held a hammer until their palms burned, never scraped knuckles on brick or caught splinters deep enough to bleed. They didn't know what these hands had done, but tonight it hurt. Maybe it was because I'd spent the day in the garage, fixing the drawer that always sticks in the kitchen, the one they never notice unless it's broken. Maybe it was because I'd spent the morning at the cemetery, kneeling beside the woman whose wedding ring I'd crafted with these same hands. Maybe it was just getting old, getting quiet, getting forgotten. They kept laughing. The joke bounced around the table like a tennis ball in a game I was no longer invited to play. My daughter smiled and waved it off. "Come on, Dad, don't be so serious. It's just a joke." But I wasn't being serious. I was being silent. And that's what hurt the most, that no one saw the difference. My fingers twitched. Calloused, scarred, stiff from years of holding more than just tools, holding dreams, holding doors open, holding babies against my chest in the dark, while their parents argued in the next room. And now these hands were punchlines. I looked at them, really looked, for the first time in a while. The thick veins, the knotted joints, the brown spots like old paint splatter. Ugly maybe, but they had held roofs above heads, built beds, carved names into wood just to make a child smile. No one asked how I felt. No one noticed that I didn't finish my meal. They kept eating, talking, scrolling. And I realized then, this wasn't about one joke. It was about erosion. Not sudden, not loud, just slow. You give everything piece by piece. And one day you wake up and find that what remains isn't respect or reverence. It's a laugh over dinner. They saw ugliness. I remembered legacy. And as I quietly picked up the dishes no one noticed, I made a quiet promise to myself. One day, they'll see what these hands have built. Not when they mock them, but when they need them. And only then, maybe, they'll understand. Friends, let me take a short pause. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this? A moment when someone laughed at what you gave your whole life to? If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. He walked home alone, not because they forgot to offer a ride. They had, in fact, cheerfully waved him off from the porch. "Night, Grandpa." Smiles, hugs, a plastic container of leftovers pressed into his hands. Everything looked right on the outside. But inside, something had shifted. Something quiet, something cold. The laughter still rang in his ears. Not malicious, just careless. And that was the part that hurt. He reached his front door, fumbled with the keys a little. Not from age, but from thinking. From feeling too much. From not saying what he'd wanted to say. Again. Inside, the house greeted him the way it always did. Still, familiar, empty. The chair in the corner waited. The photos on the mantel remained frozen in time. Weddings, Christmas mornings, little hands holding his bigger, stronger ones. Back when those hands were seen as something safe, something to trust, something to run to when the world felt too big. Now they were a punchline. He placed the leftovers in the fridge without appetite, removed his shoes without a sound, then sat down at the table and for a long moment just looked at them. His hands, not the way others did, not with the judgment of smooth-skinned youth who'd never had to build anything that could collapse if they got it wrong. No, he looked at them the way a soldier might look at his boots after the war, with reverence and ache. There were stories in every scar, the jagged mark across his palm, from the day he tried to fix a stranger's roof during a storm, the thickened knuckle, broken when he caught a falling beam with one arm, saving the rest of the crew. The burns, from nights welding metal frames in winter, trying to get the shop open before sunrise. The calluses, built over decades, over seasons, over sacrifices no one ever saw, but everyone lived inside. These weren't just his hands. They were the foundation of someone else's safety. The reason his family had walls and floors and stories. But now to his grandchildren, they were gross, like a caveman, like tree bark. He turned them over slowly in the low kitchen light, bent the fingers, watched how they moved slower than they used to, how they creaked, how they shook, not from weakness but from memory. He rested them on the table, the same table he built with his own tools, the one they sat around every Christmas for over a decade, never wondering who made it, just assuming it had always been there. He closed his eyes. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that sits beside you and reminds you of everything you wish had gone differently. He thought about saying something that night, standing up, telling them, but he knew how it would have gone. The awkward silence, the forced apologies, the way everyone would look away, not out of shame but discomfort. It wouldn't have changed anything. Not really, because they didn't mean to hurt him. They just didn't know what it means to carry love in your hands. And still, that didn't make it hurt less. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and watched the darkness fold over the neighborhood he helped build. A dog barked 2 doors down. Someone's porch light flicked off. And in the glow of the street lamp, he whispered something no one would hear. One day you'll understand, not out of anger, not for revenge, but because life has a way of teaching what youth doesn't value, until it's gone. And when that day came, he wanted to be ready. The next morning, the house woke up slowly, as if mirroring the man who lived in it. Sunlight spilled through half-closed blinds, tracing the shape of worn furniture, settling on photographs that hadn't moved in years. Dust danced lazily in the air, undisturbed by footsteps or voices. Silence filled the corners, not heavy like the night before, but hollow, tired. He didn't head to the kitchen, not yet. Instead, he moved down the narrow hallway that led to the garage. The door groaned when he opened it, as though even it had forgotten what it was like to be touched. The garage was cold, dimensiones, and filled with things no one remembered but him. Stacks of wood in the far corner, bent nails in a rusting coffee tin, an old blueprint rolled up beside empty cans of varnish. The scent of sawdust still lived faintly in the walls, buried beneath years of neglect and silence. In the center of it all stood the workbench, and under the workbench, the toolbox. It hadn't been opened in years. He bent down slowly, knees creaking louder than the floorboards, and slid it out. The latches stuck a little. He forced them gently, then lifted the lid. The inside was like a photograph of another life. Each tool in its place, each scratch and stain on the wood told a story his grandchildren had never heard. He ran his hand over the handle of the chisel, the one he'd used to carve the cradle for his granddaughter when she was born. He remembered the night clearly, the soft lamp glow in the garage, the sound of winter wind outside, the radio playing some old jazz tune no one else in the family liked but her grandmother. He remembered sanding the wood until it was smooth enough not to catch her blanket. He remembered engraving her initials in the underside, where no one else would see, but he would always know it was there. She used that cradle for a year. Then it was boxed up and forgotten. Now when she walks past him, she scrolls her phone and calls his hands prehistoric. He set the chisel down and lifted the hammer. Its grip was worn, the metal head dark with age. This one helped him build the porch. The same porch where the family took every Easter photo for 15 years. They never asked who built it. To them it was just there, like the house. Like the doors that never jammed, like the drawers that slid smoothly, like the fence that held back the world when they were young. To them, these things simply existed. To him, they were hours, nights, frozen fingers and aching shoulders, and one man's quiet mission to give his family more than he ever had. He sat down on the stool beside the bench. His hands trembled slightly as they touched the smooth handle of the wood plane. But it wasn't age. It was memory. It was grief. It was the weight of being erased, slowly, without anyone noticing. Not out of cruelty, but out of comfort. Because when something always works, you stop wondering why. He took a breath, long, slow, then reached for a scrap of oak from the stack. He wasn't sure yet what he'd make, but for the first time in years he wanted to make something. Not for them, not yet. For himself, for the man inside the silence, for the father, the builder, the ghost they had laughed at without seeing. The blade of the chisel bit softly into the wood, and the first curl fell to the floor like a ribbon. And just like that, the old hands, mocked, dismissed, ignored, began to remember who they were and why they mattered. The basement hadn't been touched in years. He descended the narrow wooden stairs carefully, one hand on the rail, the other holding the small flashlight. The switch by the door hadn't worked in over a decade, and no one ever cared to fix it, not even him, because what lived down there wasn't needed anymore, at least not by anyone but memory. The air was thick, cool and still, carrying the smell of cardboard and time. Boxes lined the wall labeled in faded ink, Christmas, tools, old bills. But one sat in the far corner, lid bowed from age, its tape peeling like it had tried to hold on too long. No label, no need. He knew exactly what was inside. He knelt slowly, his knees stiff, his breath tight, and opened it. Photographs, hundreds of them, loose stacks, faded edges, some still framed, others curled from years of heat and silence. He reached in gently, like touching something sacred. The first photo, a house. His house. The one he designed, framed, roofed, and painted with nothing but borrowed tools and borrowed time. He remembered standing on that roof late into the night, hammering shingles under moonlight because he couldn't afford delays. The next photo, a swing set, paint chipping, grass worn beneath the seats from years of giggles and shoes kicking high toward the sky. He built it for his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. She had called it her magic flying machine. They used it until the ropes frayed, then forgot it once the new trampoline came. Another, a large wooden table, the family table. He ran his fingers across the image. He remembered carving the legs late one summer, sweat dripping from his brow, worried if it would be done in time for Thanksgiving. It was where his daughter first wrote her name, where his son first said, "I got an A," where 3 generations had celebrated, argued, cried, and laughed. They all still used it. None remembered where it came from, or who gave it to them. He kept digging. A framed photo of him, much younger, holding the newborn, his first grandson, wrapped in a hospital blanket. He remembered rushing from the job site, covered in dust, still wearing his tool belt. He hadn't even taken it off. He just wanted to be there when the boy opened his eyes. The same boy who now laughed at his hands. Another picture, his wife. Smiling, apron on, flower on her cheek. In the kitchen he had remodeled just to make her mornings easier. He had torn down walls with his bare hands to give her more light. He closed his eyes. The ache in his chest wasn't anger. It wasn't pride either. It was grief. Grief for a lifetime of giving that had become invisible. Not because they were cruel, but because they'd never seen the cost. He looked at his hands once more, the same hands from last night's joke, the ones that built every moment in these frozen frames. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He stood up with purpose. He gathered the photos, chose a dozen of them, cleaned each glass with the edge of his shirt, wiped away dust like he was waking the memories, and then he climbed the stairs, one by one, slowly, steadily. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he knew this. It was time they remembered. Not just the hands, but the life behind them. That Sunday, the sun hung low and warm, casting long shadows across the driveway. The old man stood by the open garage, the scent of wood and old oil rising in soft waves as he swept the dust from the doorway. Inside, his tools had been carefully arranged the day before. The photos he found in the basement now lined the walls of the workshop, framed, polished, lovingly placed above the workbench. Each one a fragment of a life they never truly saw. He'd spent the whole morning preparing, polished the old stool, laid out a few of his best projects. Things with weight and memory, not fancy, not perfect, but honest, full of story, full of soul. And on the counter he placed the cradle, the same one he'd made before his first granddaughter was born. He had found it in the attic under a tarp, forgotten. Dusty, yes, but still strong, still beautiful. He looked at the clock. They would be arriving any minute. They were stopping by for lunch, his daughter had said. Just a short visit, Dad. The kids have practice later, and we've got errands. He nodded then, the same way he always did, grateful for any time at all. But this time he had a plan. When their car finally pulled up, he met them halfway, wiping his hands on a clean rag. The kids poured out first, earbuds in, half distracted, thumbs already flying across screens. His daughter waved. He smiled, hopeful. "Before lunch," he said softly, "I'd love to show you something. Just 5 minutes. I've been working on something I think you'll want to see." They looked at each other, half smirking. One of the boys rolled his eyes slightly. Not out of malice, just out of the reflex that comes from youth, thinking time is endless and stories can wait. "Later, Grandpa. We've got plans after this, remember? I'm starving." "Let's eat first, yeah? I need to charge my phone anyway." He nodded. Again. That same nod. The quiet one. The kind you give when you've been told without words that you're not part of the moment. He watched them walk past the open garage. Not one of them looked inside. Not one of them noticed the photos. Not one of them saw the cradle or the table leg from their own house, or the wooden chess set he had carved for them the year his wife died. The one they never opened. They didn't mean to hurt him, but what they didn't realize was that later had an expiration date. They laughed at the table, scrolled through videos, talked about things he didn't understand. He stood in the doorway of the garage a little longer, waiting, hoping someone would turn around. Even just once, no one did. And in those small, unspoken moments, he heard what they weren't saying. "You're not a part of this. You can wait. You don't matter enough today." He sat back on the stool in the garage. The light was dimmer now, but everything around him seemed to glow with a different kind of life. One that didn't need applause. One that didn't beg for attention. And yet, even knowing that didn't make the silence feel any less sharp. He ran his fingers along the edge of the workbench. It still bore the scratches from when he'd built that swing set. The same one his grandson once called the Flying Palace. The same one he now walked past without a glance. The tools didn't judge him. The wood didn't forget. Only people did. He stayed in the garage long after they'd left. And when he finally turned off the light, he whispered something soft, almost to himself. Maybe next time, or maybe never. And as the door clicked shut behind him, the quiet felt heavier than ever. The next morning, the house didn't feel like a home. It hadn't really for some time. There were no children's voices echoing through the hallways. No footsteps thudding up the stairs. No clatter of dishes. No calls of, "Grandpa, look," from the kitchen or the yard. Just stillness. Not the comforting kind. The kind that settles when people forget to come back. He brewed his coffee in silence, let it go cold, then poured it out. Instead of sitting in front of the television like usual, he made his way back to the garage. The air was cool inside, not from weather, but from time. It was the kind of space that remembered him even when the people in his life didn't. He rolled up his sleeves and picked up a cloth, then ran it across the old oak tabletop. Dust bloomed into the air like smoke. He didn't rush. Every movement was slow, careful, deliberate. Like he was polishing not just the wood, but something much more fragile. Memory. The table was one of the first things he ever built on his own, back when he was newly married and broke but proud. They had eaten every meal on that table for 30 years. His children had grown up around it. It had seen joy, arguments, prayers, empty plates, birthday candles, and now it sat in a corner of the workshop, forgotten like everything else. He opened a small drawer and pulled out the oil he hadn't used in years, rubbed it into the wood with quiet reverence, watching it darken and shine under his fingers, the same fingers they had laughed at, the same hands they never asked about. Time passed slowly. He moved next to the cradle. It still creaked when touched, but only gently, like it remembered being rocked. He cleaned each curve of the frame, running his thumb over the initials he'd carved beneath the base, the ones no one ever noticed. He didn't need anyone to notice them now. He just needed to remember that he had. Outside, the world moved on. He heard the neighbor mowing the lawn. A dog barked in the distance. A child screamed in laughter, someone else's grandchild. The sun moved across the sky without asking if anyone was watching. Inside, he worked. Not for legacy, not for pride, not to prove anything, but because his hands still knew how. And sometimes, The only way to speak, when the world refuses to listen, is to create something beautiful anyway. He sharpened old blades, cleaned rust from pliers, reorganized drawers filled with screws and nails, bits of metal and splinters of memory. Each object had a story, and today he listened to them all. He didn't stop for lunch, didn't check his phone. It hadn't buzzed all day anyway. By late afternoon, his shirt was damp with sweat, and sawdust clung to his sleeves. He stepped back, looked around the space. The tools gleamed under the soft light. The table was warm again, alive. The cradle hummed with quiet dignity. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel useless. He didn't feel like a relic or a burden or a joke. He felt needed. By the wood, by the work. By the silence that didn't mock him, it held him. That night he didn't sleep right away. He sat alone in the garage until well past sunset, not waiting for anyone, just being, the kind of being he used to give to others. Now he gave it back to himself. And even though no one knocked, no one called, no one came back to ask what he'd wanted to show them, he still polished, still sanded, still breathed deeply into the space that remembered his worth, when everyone else forgot. Because sometimes when no one else listens, your own hands are the only ones left to hold your story. The idea came to him sometime in the quiet stretch between dusk and night. That soft hour where the sun hesitates on the horizon and even the air seems to hold its breath. He stood in his workshop, surrounded by scraps, small cuts of cherry wood, a leftover piece of maple, an old hinge he'd saved from a drawer that once belonged to his wife's sewing cabinet. Most people would have thrown them out, worthless now, useless, but he had always believed in second chances, in forgotten things still holding meaning, and so from the wood no one wanted, he began to shape something with care. For his granddaughter, he built a small jewelry box. Nothing grand, just a simple, elegant piece, sanded smooth and lined with faded velvet from an old keepsake drawer. On the lid he carved the first letter of her name. He remembered the way she used to run into his arms with sticky fingers and tangled hair, breathless from play. She used to love stories about princesses and treasure chests. This box was small enough for both. For his grandson, he crafted a tablet stand. He had noticed the boy always propping his device up against mugs, books, whatever he could find. The wood he used was from the frame of an old chair, the one the boy used to climb when he was too small to reach the cookies. Funny how even the forgotten pieces of furniture held so much memory. It took 2 days, not because it was difficult, but because he took his time. Every cut was measured, every edge softened with patience. Every corner was an act of love that didn't need to be loud. He wrapped them both in brown paper, tied with string. Not store-bought wrapping, just real. Just his. That weekend they came over briefly. A quick visit between errands and games and birthday parties he wasn't invited to. He handed them the packages at the door, his voice soft but hopeful. "I made these for you." They opened them without fanfare. His granddaughter peeled back the paper and lifted the box. She turned it in her hands once, glanced at it like it was something she didn't quite understand. "Oh, thanks, Grandpa," she said, already reaching for her phone. His grandson looked at the stand, mumbled, "Cool," and set it on the hallway table, next to his jacket, where it sat the rest of the visit. No one asked how long it took. No one noticed the carving. No one asked what kind of wood it was or why it smelled faintly like the attic where they used to play. And no one saw his smile falter just for a second. He caught it quickly. Years of practice had made him good at that. He nodded. "I thought it might be useful," he said lightly, brushing off their indifference the way he used to brush sawdust off his shoulders. They moved on, talking about school, about new phones, about the mall. They left the garage door open behind them. He stood for a moment, alone again. The silence rushed in like water after a dam breaks. His hands, the same ones they'd mocked, the same ones that had shaped those gifts, hung heavy at his sides. He didn't expect applause. Not really. He didn't want to be celebrated. But a look, one moment of stillness, one question like, "How did you make it, Grandpa?" That would have been enough. Instead, they had taken the pieces of his heart and carried them away like items from a dollar bin. Light in hand, and lighter in meaning. He turned back to the workbench, sat down, rested his fingers on the worn wood. He could still feel their weight, not the gifts, the silence, and yet he didn't regret making them, because love, he had learned long ago, doesn't always echo back. Sometimes it lands in silence. Sometimes it disappears into busy hands and distracted glances. Sometimes it's held by someone who never knows they're holding it. But even then, even when it vanishes without thanks, it's still love. He looked down at his hands, rough, quiet, steady, and he whispered more to himself than anyone else. At least I made something that will outlast their memory of me, and he got back to work. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. He almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and these days most calls were either wrong numbers or machines pretending to care. But something made him pick up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the long stretch of silence that had filled his day like water in a sinking boat. "Mr. Hale?" a woman's voice asked. He straightened in his chair. The name hadn't been spoken like that in a while, not as background noise or polite obligation, but with interest. "This is Mrs. Landry. I teach your grandson, Liam, 4th grade. His heart paused, like it always did when his grandchildren's names came up. The world shrank a little, leaned in. "I just wanted to ask, he told the class something today that surprised me." She laughed softly, kindly. "He said his grandpa built one of the houses on Elm Street, the white one with the wide porch and the stone path. Said it was in the newspaper once. A real builder, he called you." The line went quiet. He looked down at his hands, stained faintly from wood stain, dust still in his nails from sanding a frame that morning. The white house on Elm. Yes, he had built that. From the foundation to the last coat of paint. 27 years ago. And yes, the paper had done a small piece on him. Back when people still told stories about working men. Back when hands like his were something boys wanted to grow into, not laugh at. "Is it true?" she asked gently. He opened his mouth, closed it, because suddenly he didn't know what to say. Yes, it was true. Every word. But what did truth mean if it didn't live in the house you built for your own? His grandson didn't know because he'd asked. He knew because maybe, just maybe, the house itself had whispered the story, or because someone else had mentioned it in passing, not because he had ever sat on Grandpa's knee and heard it from the source. He thought of the gifts he'd carved, the stories behind every line in his hands, the garage full of frames that spoke louder than the family ever had. And then he thought of Liam, a boy who would grow up in a world that measured worth by speed and shine, not strength and sacrifice. He cleared his throat, voice low. "I did," he said finally. "That house, it was one of my proudest builds." She smiled through the phone. "I thought so. He talked about you like a hero today." His chest tightened. Hero. He almost wanted to laugh, or cry, or ask, "How can you be a hero to someone who never hears your voice?" But instead, he thanked her politely, said he was glad to hear Liam had shared that. They hung up. He sat still for a long time. The garage felt different now, not because it had changed, but because something inside him had stirred. A memory not of tools, but of being known. Once, somewhere, briefly. He walked to a shelf and pulled out the old newspaper clipping. Yellowed edges, faded ink. His younger face beside a 2-story home, and the headline, "Built with Heart, Local Man Crafts Family Dreams from Wood." He stared at the photo, not out of vanity, out of longing, because he realized his family lived inside his legacy, but they'd never stopped to ask where the walls came from. And maybe that was the real silence, not the quiet in the house, but the absence of questions that said, "Tell me about you." He folded the article, tucked it into an envelope, wrote his grandson's name on the front, and left it on the table, not as proof, but as a seed. Maybe one day the boy would open it, maybe not. But either way, he had passed it on, because stories don't need applause. Sometimes they just need a place to land, and a chance, even the smallest, that someone might finally choose to listen. The envelope was thick, real paper, not digital, addressed in pen, not print. It stood out like something sacred among the bills and advertisements he collected from the mailbox once a week, out of habit more than need. His name, neatly written. He opened it at the kitchen table, where the morning light cast long lines across the wood. The same table his hands had built decades ago. The same one his grandchildren use now without a thought for the calluses behind each corner. Inside, a letter, simple, formal, yet full of warmth. An old friend, Martin, a fellow builder, now retired and teaching part-time, had written. He'd always been the more social of the two, the one with stories and connections, the one who remembered birthdays. There was to be an exhibition at the city's small architecture museum, a celebration of community craftsmen, builders, designers, and carpenters whose work had shaped neighborhoods, but never made the front page. And among the models on display, one was based on his design. A little white house with a wide porch and hand-carved shutters. Elm Street. He had drawn those plans on the back of an old newspaper at midnight once, candle burning beside him because his youngest child had said, "I want a house with a porch big enough for dreams." He'd made it happen. The museum had reconstructed it as a miniature. Martin had submitted it on his behalf. Quietly, lovingly. Because Martin remembered. The letter ended with a note. "I hope you'll come. People should know whose hands built their comfort." He folded the paper, held it a moment, then looked around the kitchen, at the silence, the untouched chairs, the unopened gifts on the sideboard, the phone that hadn't rung in days. He thought, for a moment, about inviting the grandkids, not out of guilt, out of hope, out of the stubborn ache that still believed in family even when it forgot you. But when he called to ask if they'd like to come, he got the familiar answer. "Sorry, Grandpa, we've got stuff this weekend." "No, not really our thing. Let us know how it goes, okay?" So he went alone. He ironed his best shirt, polished his shoes. The ones his wife used to say made him look like a man of good stories. He brushed his hair, even though most of it had given up the fight years ago. At the museum, the halls were soft with light. Voices echoed in polite tones. The room wasn't large, but the displays, they breathed. Models of old libraries, town squares, quiet homes, forgotten churches, all built not by famous hands, but by real ones. His model stood in the far corner, and there, next to it, a plaque, original design by Mr. Thomas Hale. Builder, husband, father, craftsman of warmth. He stared at the model a long time. It was perfect, down to the little railings on the porch, the small swing, even the garden path made of real crushed stone. People passed by. Some read the sign, some smiled and moved on. One man, older, leaned in and whispered to his wife, "I remember that house. I'd always wondered who built it." He didn't say a word, but something inside him settled. He stood there, invisible in plain sight, as others admired the shape of his hands without knowing they were watching. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like dust. He felt included. He left as quietly as he came, walked back through the cooling evening with nothing in his pockets, but a folded program from the exhibit. It now bore his name. It didn't make him young again. It didn't change the silence waiting at home. But it mattered, because somewhere in a room of strangers his hands had been seen, his work honored, his life framed. And even if his grandchildren weren't there, he had stood in front of his story and remembered who he was. He hadn't expected a crowd, certainly not attention. Maybe a glance, a nod, a polite, "Oh, nice" model from a passerby who didn't stay long enough to care. But the room surprised him, not because it was full, but because it was still, not silent, but reverent. People didn't just look, they lingered, and there it was, on the wall, just above the model, under soft lighting that made everything seem golden. Thomas Hale, builder, craftsman, quiet maker of homes. Below the name, a photo from decades ago, his younger self, sleeves rolled up, standing in front of the White House on Elm Street, one hand resting on a fence post, the other gripping a worn hammer. He remembered the day it was taken. The newspaper reporter had asked him to look proud. He hadn't known how, so he just looked honest. And now that photo hung like a memory made visible. People paused before it. Some read the plaque aloud. Others traced the lines of the house model with their eyes, then looked back at him, not realizing the man from the photo was standing just a few feet away, older now, grayer, but still there. He stayed back at first. But then a young man approached, late 20s, maybe 30, wearing a messenger bag and a jacket that didn't quite fit, like life had been pulling at him lately. He stood before the plaque a long time, then turned, scanning the room. Their eyes met, and the young man stepped closer, hesitant. "Excuse me," he said, "are you Thomas Hale?" His voice had the tremble of someone meeting a quiet legend. Not the famous kind, the kind that matters more. The kind that shaped their childhood without knowing it. "Yes," the old man answered. The young man smiled, eyes bright. "You built 112 Elm Street, right?" He nodded slowly. "My dad grew up in that house. He told me stories about it all the time. The creaky stair, the porch swing, the way the kitchen caught the morning sun through the east window. He always said that house felt different, like someone built it with care, not speed." He swallowed, emotion welling in his throat. "My grandfather died before I was born, but that house, it felt like he was there, like love was in the walls." The old man didn't speak at first, because the tears that came, they were quiet, like everything else in his life, but they were real. Someone remembered. Someone saw the invisible, not for the jokes, not for the silence, but for the strength that stood when no one clapped. They talked a little longer, about that house, about the swing, about how the boy's father refused to sell it, even when he'd moved away, just because someone built this for love, not money. When the young man left, he shook Thomas's hand and said, "You didn't just build homes, you built memories." And in that moment, the years of being unseen cracked, gently like frost melting beneath light. Because now his name wasn't just in dusty records or forgotten corners. It was on the wall, in the light, spoken out loud by strangers, and carried in the hearts of families he never even knew he'd touched. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he knew he mattered. It was never planned. Life rarely hands out redemption through calendars. The museum trip had been organized by the school weeks ago, a cultural enrichment day, a break from tests and screens. None of the students were particularly excited. They filed through the glass doors more out of duty than interest, laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, sneakers squeaking against polished floors. Among them, Liam, the same grandson who once chuckled at his grandfather's hands, the one who took the tablet stand and forgot it on the hallway table, the one who thought old things were just that, old. He dragged his feet through the first few exhibits, exchanging bored glances with his friends. Artifacts, sketches, old building plans, all things that felt dusty even when they were behind clean glass. But then he rounded the corner and stopped. There, under the glow of warm light, was a photo. Framed, simple, proud, a man in his 30s. Strong building, broad shoulders, shirt sleeves rolled, hammer in hand. A faint smile on a face that didn't need to prove anything. Below the photo he read the name. Thomas Hale. Builder, craftsman, quiet maker of homes. His world paused. He blinked, leaned closer, then closer still. He didn't even hear the footsteps behind him until a voice asked, "You okay, man?" Liam didn't answer at first. He was staring, not at the model house or the plaque, but at the eyes in the photo, eyes that looked familiar, too familiar, and then it hit him. That wasn't just a craftsman. That wasn't just a builder. That was his grandfather. His voice cracked when he finally said, This is my grandpa." The group fell quiet. No teasing, no snickering, just silence. And then one of the students, a tall boy with scuffed shoes and messy hair, said softly, "Dude, your grandpa built that?" Another whispered, "This is beautiful." Someone else leaned in, taking a photo of the model with their phone. Liam stood frozen, part awe, part guilt, part something deeper he couldn't name. He thought back to the jokes, the way they laughed at those hands, the way he laughed. He remembered the last time he looked at his grandfather without seeing him, and now here he was, being seen by everyone, admired, respected. Liam read the plaque again. Every word felt like a story he'd never asked to hear, a legacy he'd ignored because it didn't come with flashing lights or loud applause. That night, long after the class had left, he sat on his bed holding the museum brochure. On the back, a list of the craftsmen featured, and beside one of the names, a handwritten note. The strongest homes are built by the quietest hands. He didn't know who had written it. Maybe the curator, maybe a guest. But he knew now what he needed to do. He pulled out the old tablet stand from his drawer. dusted it off, turned it over, and for the first time he noticed something carved lightly beneath the base. Tiats. He traced the initials with his fingertip, slowly, carefully, and for the first time in his young life, he felt the weight of love that had never asked for thanks. Only time, and time, at last, was listening. The evening train swayed gently, its rhythm a soft, metallic heartbeat against the windows. The man sat by himself, as he often did, in the third car, second row, near the window. His coat folded neatly beside him, the program from the museum still tucked into the inside pocket. He looked out at the blur of fields and tired buildings rushing past, but his mind was not with the landscape. It was still in that hall of models, in the hushed voices of strangers reading his name like it belonged among important ones. It was still with the young man who had spoken of porches and sunlight, who called him a builder of memories. His hands rested on his lap. For once, they didn't ache. He didn't rush home. He didn't expect anyone to ask where he had been. So when the bus dropped him off near his street, and he began his slow walk up the familiar road, what he saw next made him stop short. There at the edge of the driveway, under the soft amber glow of the street lamp, stood Liam, his grandson, alone, still, hands in pockets, shoulders drawn in the way boys do when pride has softened into something closer to shame. The old man blinked, unsure if he was seeing right, but it was real. Liam looked up, and in his arms, not a phone, not a basketball, not his backpack, but the wooden tablet stand, the same one he'd barely glanced at the first time, now held like something fragile, reverent. The old man stepped closer. They stood face to face, the wind curling gently between them, and for a long moment neither spoke. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves above, and the creak of the old gate swinging behind them. Then Liam, voice quieter than he had ever used with him, asked, "You made this?" His grandfather nodded. "Like with those tools, that old shed?" Another nod. Liam swallowed, eyes flicking down to the stand, then back up. "I saw your name at the museum, on the wall, the model, the house with the swing." His voice broke, not from tears, not yet, but from realization, the kind that doesn't land with thunder, but with a slow, aching gravity. "I didn't know," he whispered. The old man didn't answer right away. He looked at his grandson's hands holding the stand. He could see it now, the small shift. Not in posture, but in presence. He wasn't just holding wood. He was holding work, memory, worth. Finally, the old man said quietly, "No one asked." Liam's face twisted. Guilt, grief, a boy meeting the man he never saw. "I'm sorry," he said. I joked about your hands. I didn't get it. I didn't see." His grandfather's eyes softened, voice steady. "You see now." Liam nodded, biting his lip. A beat passed. "I want to know," he said. "I mean, really? The house, the swing, the table, all of it?" The old man let out a slow breath. For years, silence had been his closest company. But tonight, it stepped aside. He reached out, not for the stand, but gently placed his hand on Liam's shoulder. "Come inside," he said. "There's time." And together they walked past the gate, past the porch, into the home that had always been open, even when no one noticed the man who built it. The door creaked as it opened, not from rust, but from time. The hinges knew this movement. They'd sung the same note for decades. But tonight, they sang it for someone new. The boy stepped in first, uncertain, eyes adjusting to the warm, golden light spilling from the single bulb that hung above the workbench. The workshop was not grand. It wasn't neat in the way magazines showed, but it breathed. Every surface carried a memory. Every corner, a whisper of something once shaped by steady hands and quiet care. The old man stepped in behind him, the wood floor groaning gently beneath his weight. He moved slowly, not from weakness, but from reverence. "This," he said softly, laying a hand on the worn table by the door, "was the first bench I ever built, before your father was born, before the porch swing, before the cradles." Liam looked around. His eyes landed on a rack of tools, each one worn with handles darkened by years of work. There were hammers with smooth grips, chisels with edges dulled and resharpened 100 times, levels older than he was. The boy didn't touch anything, not out of fear, but out of respect. The grandfather reached for a rolled-up piece of parchment resting on a shelf. He unrolled it carefully, smoothing out the edges. A blueprint of the Elm Street house. Lines, angles, notes scribbled in pencil along the borders. Measurements, window placement, a little sketch of the garden path in the corner. I drew this at the kitchen table. Your grandma was baking. I had flour on the paper by the end of it, but I knew even then this was more than lumber. It was a place for voices to echo, for shoes to squeak, for birthdays to be remembered. Liam leaned in, silent, studying. His grandfather moved to a tall cabinet and opened the door. Inside, photographs. Yellowed, some curled at the edges. One showed the Elm Street house half-built, beams exposed, the swing missing. Another showed him much younger, holding a newborn, Liam's father. Others showed the workshop itself, before the walls were lined with years. Liam picked up one photo. His voice came low. "You made all this with your hands?" The old man didn't answer with words. He just held up those same hands, gnarled, veined, strong even in their age. Liam didn't flinch, didn't look away. For the first time he saw not the roughness, but the record, like the rings of a tree. Each callus was a chapter, each scar a sacrifice, each vein a road traveled for someone else's comfort. The grandfather motioned toward a small stool. "Sit," he said. "I'll show you something." He reached under the workbench and pulled out a little block of wood, smooth, unshaped, a beginning. Then he placed a chisel in Liam's hands, showed him how to hold it, guided him gently not to carve, but to feel. And as they sat there, surrounded by the scent of cedar and dust and history, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of what was never said. It was the silence of being heard, not by words, but by time, by tools, by presence. That night, the boy didn't ask to go watch TV, didn't check his phone, didn't call this boring. He stayed, because for the first time, he wasn't looking at hands. He was reading the story they had always been waiting to tell. It started with a message, not from Liam, but through him. A thread that unraveled in reverse, from a grandson's heart back to the very foundation he never knew he stood on. Within a week they came, not with fanfare, not because of duty, but because the silence had finally grown loud enough to echo across their own memories. His daughter arrived first, holding a casserole dish like it might say the things she couldn't. Behind her, her husband, eyes low, shoulders heavy with years unspoken. Then came Liam's parents, hands full of groceries they didn't need but brought anyway, as if bread and fruit could stitch time back together. The youngest ones trailed behind, curious, unsure, wide-eyed at the idea that there was something in the backyard more interesting than Wi-Fi. They stepped into the workshop one by one. It wasn't cleaned for a visit. It was just as it had always been. Worn, honest, breathing with the soft pulse of long-forgotten things. But today it didn't feel dusty. It felt sacred. He didn't make speeches. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked to the shelf and pulled down a small wooden chair. "This," he said, placing it gently on the floor, "was yours." He nodded toward his daughter. She stared, stunned. "You were two. You used to drag it across the kitchen just so you could climb up and stir the pancake batter." She touched the backrest, her fingers trembling slightly. He pointed to the corner where the rocker sat. "And that," he said, looking at his son, "was where you slept the first night we brought you home from the hospital. Your mother sat there until sunrise, humming because you wouldn't stop crying." A hush fell. He moved from object to object. A low table scarred by crayons, a crib with initials carved on the rail, a coat rack with hooks installed just low enough for small hands. He wasn't showing them furniture. He was showing them presence, the invisible thread between love and labor. He paused at the dining table. "This one," he said softly, "was built when we had nothing but hope. We couldn't afford the one at the store, so I made it. Right here." He ran his fingers across the wood, the very wood where hands had once held each other in prayer, where school books had opened, where birthdays had been sung with crooked candles and tired smiles. His voice softened. You ate every meal of your childhood here. But I never said. I built it because I didn't want you to grow up around absence. Liam looked around at the others. No one spoke, because they were all remembering things they didn't know they remembered. The way the floors never squeaked beneath the crib, the way the swing never snapped, even after years of pulling, the way the house always felt safe. None of it had come from nowhere. It had come from him, from hands that didn't ask for thanks, from a heart that gave without applause. One of the younger kids tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa," she said, "did you build all this?" He looked around the room, not just at the walls and the chairs and the frames, but at the people, his family. He nodded. "I did." And they stood there, sons, daughters, grandchildren, not around a monument, but a man. Not just a builder of homes, but the builder of them. And in that small sawdust-filled room, with light pouring in through the high windows and the scent of wood and memory thick in the air, something settled. Not just admiration, not just respect, but recognition of a life lived not loudly, but with hands that never stopped giving, and hearts that finally had learned how to receive. The light through the kitchen windows was soft, the kind of golden late afternoon glow that only seems to arrive on the days you'll remember. Dust floated in the air like quiet confetti. Someone had just finished cutting bread. Someone else was pouring lemonade into tall glasses. The voices were gentle now. No one was shouting over each other. No one was rushing to leave. The family sat around the table, his table, the same table that had stood for decades, the one he built from pine he couldn't afford, planned by hand, varnished late into the night with the radio on, and his young children asleep down the hall. It had survived spills, tantrums, elbows, pencils, politics, and prayer. And now it stood stronger than ever, not because the wood hadn't cracked, but because he hadn't. 3 generations crowded around it that day. No one was looking at their phones. No one was talking about work. They were passing stories, pausing to laugh, nodding when someone's voice wavered, the way people do when they finally understand they're part of something bigger than themselves. Someone suggested a photo. He didn't protest, not this time. They cleared the dishes but left the crumbs, because real life doesn't wait for perfect. He sat at the head of the table, not because he asked to, but because they insisted, and one by one they gathered behind him. His children, their children, and him, the man whose hands had once been mocked, now resting gently on the wood that still held them all. As the camera clicked, he didn't smile for the lens. He smiled for the moment, because this was what he had built. Later, when the photo was printed and slipped into a frame, a small card came with it. Folded hand-drawn flowers on the front, the handwriting still shaky and uneven. It was from his youngest granddaughter. Inside, in careful letters, she had written, "Now when I see your hands, I see our house. I see the swing. I see my bed. I see love. Thank you, Grandpa." He read it twice, then a third time slower. And something in him, something long buried under years of being overlooked, laughed at, and left outside the conversation, finally unfolded. Not in words, not even in tears, but in peace. Because now the hands they once mocked weren't symbols of what was broken or strange. They were signatures, carved into the heartwood of their lives. The calluses weren't flaws. They were proof. Proof of holding, of building, of never letting go. He folded the card gently and placed it in his drawer, next to the first blueprint he ever drew. The one with the pencil smudge from the day his daughter spilled juice while playing nearby. And as he sat alone that evening, the house now quiet again, he looked at his hands one last time. The scars were still there, the bones still stiff, but the shame? Gone. Because finally his hands weren't just tools, they were testament. And love, when remembered, can heal even what was never spoken. That was his legacy. Not the wood, not the walls, but the way they looked at him now, not as an old man with rough hands, but as the one who built everything they stood on.